Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for taking out time to join us for this specific webinar. My name is Darlington Chuma, and I'm a researcher at AIA. And today we are extremely privileged to have three of our speakers join us to on our webinar on discussing. We're basically going to be discussing the Senegal's recent election and then trying to unpack what the election means for the future of Senegal, but also for the broader region in West Africa. So the way that we're going to proceed with the webinar is that each speaker will be allocated approximately 15 minutes to discuss. In fact, we've divided the webinar into 3 sessions. And then we'll have the closing remarks by Maria Luisa, who's the head of the program at AIA. So just as a way of recap, this is how we've designed the first session is going to look at roughly the title is that Senegal's recent election represent a crisis or a catalyst for democratic renewal. And then Isa Kante with the ISIS in Dakar will moderate the session. I'll give a presentation. And then the second part of the webinar will be on assessing Senegal's governance. And here Enoch Wendy, also with the ISS in Pretoria, will give his presentation. And then the last part of, the third part of the webinar will be lessons for the region. And here Tenny Tayo, policy researcher, who give a presentation. And then we'll have a question and answer session, approximately 35 to 40 minutes. And then, so how we're going to proceed is that we'll have the presentations first, and then open up the discussions in one go. So we'll allow the speakers to give their perspectives and their presentations, and then we'll open it up for a question and answer session. And then Maria Luisa will wrap up the session to give you an idea of the work that we're doing at AIA and also future programs. But as a way of introduction, so Isa Kante, rather, is a researcher at the ISS in West Africa, and the areas of interest are governance, security in West Africa. She holds a postgraduate degree in strategic studies and risk management. And then Enoch Aikins is also a researcher in the African Futures and Innovation Program with the Institute for Security Studies, also in Pretoria. So previously, he worked as a program officer for the Institute for Democratic Governance in Accra, Ghana, and his expertise include African politics, governance, economic development, public sector reform, poverty, and he holds a postgraduate qualification from the University of Ghana. And then our third speaker is Tenny Tayo, who's a policy advisor with a focus on regional integrating issues in West Africa and the African continent. She's the principal advisor at Elenet, where she leads on the governance, trade and investment and development policy. She's also economic intelligence lead at Nigeria's early warning directorate under ECOWAS. She's published extensively on these issues. And so without much of your time, then maybe, just to give a background. So we want to unpack the Senegal's recent election, and how we intend to do that is the first part is that this is one of the programs that will be initiatives that we'll be doing at AIA, and as you might know, there are about 21 elections that are going to be happening on the African continent. So we intend to select a few that we're going to host webinars in this format, and bring in different aspects to talk about, not just the elections themselves, but their broader implications from an economic, political, and social perspective. So this is one of the first, and I'm extremely delighted to have our panelists join us today. So to address the first aspect of the webinar, and I'll give the floor to Aisa Kante, please. Aisa Kante, please take the floor. And thank you.
Thank you, Darlington. Je pense qu'avec cette élection, on a vraiment failli connaître le pire. Le Sénégal a vraiment failli connaître le pire. Et ces dernières années, nous avons tous été témoins des épisodes de violence, de violation des droits et libertés au Sénégal. Pour ce qui concerne plus précisément la phase préélectorale, on avait noté un certain nombre de défis, de controverses, notamment des accusations de corruption non confirmées à l'encontre de 2 magistrats du Conseil constitutionnel et du Premier ministre Amadou Ba. Donc c'est sur cette base que le président Macky Sall avait décidé de reporter l'élection présidentielle. C'était une décision qui a mis un coup d'arrêt au processus électoral à 10 heures du démarrage de la campagne électorale. C'est une décision qui a plongé le Sénégal dans une situation d'impasse et qui avait été suivie de l'adoption d'une loi actant ce report par les députés de la coalition Benno Bokk Yakaar et le Parti démocratique sénégalais. Donc la loi a été adoptée sans débat suite à l'expulsion des députés de l'opposition de l'hémicycle par la gendarmerie. Donc cette loi reportait l'élection présidentielle au 15 décembre 2024 et prolongeait de facto le mandat du président de la République au-delà du 2 avril 2024. Donc c'est précisément cet épisode qui a renforcé la perception d'un recul démocratique au sein de l'opinion nationale. Elle a aussi suscité l'inquiétude d'acteurs régionaux et internationaux quant à la trajectoire du Sénégal. Les raisons qui avaient été avancées par le président pour soutenir le report de ce scrutin n'ont pas convaincu une bonne partie de l'opinion nationale. Il s'en est suivi une forte mobilisation des organisations de la société civile, des universitaires, des acteurs religieux et de la population pour réclamer la tenue des élections avant le 2 avril. On a également le Conseil constitutionnel qui a joué un rôle fondamental alors qu'elle se déclarait souvent incompétente pour apprécier les lois constitutionnelles. Donc le Conseil constitutionnel a véritablement pris sa responsabilité en demandant au président de respecter la Constitution en son article 27 qui dispose que nul ne peut exercer plus de 2 mandats consécutifs et le mandat du président de la République est de 5 ans. Donc le Conseil constitutionnel a insisté sur le respect de la durée du mandat du président, mais aussi sur le respect de la clause d'intangibilité qui interdit toute modification sur le nombre et la durée du mandat. Un autre aspect tout aussi clé, c'est le respect des traditions républicaines, c'est-à-dire le respect du calendrier électoral, avec cette incertitude au-delà du 2 avril qui a été bien évidemment source d'inquiétude. Donc, on peut dire que cette élection a contribué à la consolidation des acquis démocratiques et a montré à quel point la démocratie au Sénégal reste solide, alors qu'on craignait véritablement que le pays ne bascule dans l'instabilité. Donc, il faut aussi ajouter que cette élection a été organisée en l'espace de quelques jours, avec un résultat accepté de tous. Ça montre encore une fois que le Sénégal a un système électoral solide. Et c'est ce qui explique aussi qu'il n'y ait pas eu de défis ou de controverses majeures autour des résultats de cette élection. Enfin, les Sénégalais ont montré leur maturité. Ils ont préféré l'option des urnes et ils ne pouvaient pas concevoir qu'on retire ce droit de choisir leur président. Maintenant, pour ce qui est des facteurs qui ont contribué à la victoire de Bassirou Diomaye Faye, je pense qu'il y en a plusieurs. Le premier facteur relève de la nature même de cette élection qui avait une allure de référendum. Donc, il s'agissait de voter pour la continuité du régime de Macky Sall, incarné par le candidat Amadou Ba, ou de voter pour la rupture incarnée par la coalition Diomaye. Donc, cette coalition Diomaye incarnait le rejet d'une manière de gouverner par la corruption et la répression. C'était une élection donc très polarisée entre 2 pôles forts, donc avec d'un côté la coalition Diomaye et de l'autre la coalition qui portait la candidature de Amadou Ba. Donc on voit bien avec les résultats l'écart profond qu'il y a entre, d'une part, les candidats arrivés en tête, donc Bassirou Diomaye Faye et Amadou Ba, et d'autre part, les autres candidats de l'opposition. Le deuxième facteur qui a contribué à la victoire de Bassirou Diomaye Faye, c'est un facteur qui est lié au premier, c'est celui du profond désir de changement par rapport aux pratiques politiques et de gouvernance observées sous le régime de Macky Sall. Donc Macky Sall n'avait pas tenu ses promesses et à son arrivée, il avait promis de gouverner de façon sobre et vertueuse. Mais au lieu de ça, on a eu un certain nombre de scandales financiers qui ont émaillé son régime. Macky Sall a tenté aussi, entre guillemets, de réduire l'opposition à sa plus simple expression. Et pour cela, on a eu une instrumentalisation de l'appareil judiciaire. Et il faut aussi noter que si le bilan matériel sous Macky Sall est plutôt positif avec la construction de nombreuses infrastructures, le bilan immatériel, lui, est peu reluisant avec une gouvernance et un respect des droits et libertés qui n'ont pas tellement été respectés, avec de nombreux écueils de ce point de vue. Et à cela s'ajoute également on peut citer la précarité socio-économique avec pour corollaire l'immigration clandestine. Le taux de pauvreté au Sénégal tourne autour de 37% en 2022 selon la Banque mondiale. Le pays est classé 169e sur 193 pays pour ce qui est de l'indice de développement humain. Le troisième facteur qui est plus politique et qui prend en compte deux aspects, c'est avec le premier aspect, c'est l'implosion de la majorité Benno Bokk Yakaar qui est liée au flou autour de la troisième candidature de Macky Sall, qui n'avait pas préparé son successeur, avec Amadou Ba qui a été fortement combattu dans son propre camp. Le deuxième aspect de ce facteur plus politique est lié à la stratégie déployée par le PASTEF et ses alliés. Donc, le PASTEF qui a fait preuve d'une certaine résilience, et avec Ousmane Sonko qui a empêché d'être candidat à glisser trois candidatures dans la liste des candidats retenus par le Conseil constitutionnel. Le quatrième facteur qui est non négligeable, c'est le projet porté par la coalition du président Diomaye, avec le contenu de ce projet qui est en phase avec les nécessités de l'heure et les aspirations du peuple sénégalais, avec des domaines clés comme la réforme des institutions, des pratiques politiques, la lutte contre la corruption et un accent important sur la redevabilité, la moralisation de la vie publique. Un autre aspect important, c'est la souveraineté économique qui accorde une place importante à l'agriculture, mais également surtout aux ressources naturelles avec, la souveraineté économique qui passe par la renégociation des contrats miniers, des hydrocarbures et aussi des accords de pêche jugés léonins. Donc, ce sont tous ces facteurs qui ont contribué à cette troisième alternance. Pour ce qui est des marqueurs de cette présidence, donc le premier marqueur repose selon moi sur le fait que ce nouveau pouvoir se positionne comme une alternative au pouvoir précédent, pour toutes les raisons que j'ai évoquées précédemment. Même s'il est trop tôt pour parler de rupture effective, il y a dans le programme de la coalition des aspects qui tendent vers cette rupture, avec un certain nombre d'annonces, d'actes posés par le nouveau pouvoir qui montrent la volonté de mettre en place des pratiques politiques plus saines. Par exemple, on a eu la démission du président de la République de son poste de secrétaire général du PASTEF. On peut aussi citer la demande faite par le Premier ministre aux ministres nouvellement nommés de se défaire de leur mandat électif. On peut citer également la composition du nouveau gouvernement avec des profils intéressants. Et on voit que ici, dans ce nouveau gouvernement, on privilégie la compétence et l'expérience donc on est dans une certaine rupture par rapport à ce qui se faisait avant, avec un gouvernement de partage sous Macky Sall et qui s'était retrouvé piégé quelque part par des logiques clientélistes qui ont empêché de mener un certain nombre de réformes annoncées. Un autre marqueur important de cette présidence repose sur la forte attente des populations, notamment les jeunes. La jeunesse nourrit un certain espoir. Elle a payé un lourd tribut pour que la coalition Diomaye arrive au pouvoir. Donc, c'est ce qui fait qu'on a une forte exigence vis-à-vis de ce nouveau pouvoir et les attentes sont véritablement multiples, notamment en termes d'emploi, de redistribution des richesses, surtout dans la perspective de l'exploitation du pétrole et du gaz. Donc, Bassirou Diomaye Faye arrive véritablement au pouvoir dans un contexte difficile, avec un contexte marqué par un coût de la vie chère, un taux de chômage qui tourne autour de 20% en 2023. Donc, dans l'immédiat, il va falloir trouver des solutions conjoncturelles, c'est-à-dire urgentes à des problèmes structurels. Pour finir, la principale implication de cette élection sur le futur politique pour le Sénégal repose sur le fait d'avoir des citoyens donc plus exigeants vis-à-vis de leurs dirigeants en termes de redevabilité et d'avoir un système électoral relativement solide. Donc, ce sont des éléments importants qui pourront consacrer le passage d'une démocratie procédurale électoraliste à travers une clarification des règles du jeu démocratique à une démocratie qualitative au sein de laquelle les questions substantielles, économiques, santé, éducation, environnement seront au centre du débat. Donc, je vais m'en arrêter là et je vous remercie pour votre aimable attention. Merci.
Thank you, Asaito. Please take the platform.
Thank you. Hello to Darlington and colleagues, and then Tenny as well. So I'm just going to start my brief presentation with this few slides from various governance indicators on Senegal, and then I'll explain briefly as we go along. I hope to keep within the time. So the first thing that I probably want to show here is this graph. So this is from the AIIG, the African Index of the Ibrahim Index of African Governance. And if you look at the black line, which measures the overall state of governance in Senegal, you could see that generally Senegal has stagnated in terms of its governance, in terms of the score. So there has generally been a stagnation from 2012. I believe that's when President Macky Sall took over, up to this is about 2021. So there has been a general stagnation in terms of progress on governance score. Then I want to take you through this briefly. This is what we call the governance triangle for Senegal. And it measures three critical aspects of governance in Senegal. Senegal. The first one is the security. It deals with what do you call it? Security issue, insecurity, violence, threats, and all of that. You see that Senegal scores high on this index, and generally Senegal is stable without the recent protests and then the unfortunate incidents. And then the second one is what we call the governance capacity, which measures the ability of the state to translate policy into action and measures aspects like corruption and other things, which Senegal scores very low. And then the third one is inclusion, that deals with democracy and then gender empowerment. So I'll focus on the last two because those are the probably the main issues in Senegal to look at. Now, if you look at democracy in general in Senegal, based on the Afrobarometer also, there is still strong preference for democracy in Senegal. 84% of all citizens in Senegal still prefer democracy as a form of governance. But the key thing here is that democracy, in terms of how the satisfaction with how democracy works in Senegal, has declined over the years. So from 64% of the population being satisfied with how democracy works in Senegal, it has declined to about 48% in 2022. And you and I will agree with me that if it is measured last year and this year, probably the figure will even be low. So though democracy is highly preferred in Senegal, the satisfaction with how it is being practiced has declined over the years. And even more worrying is that about more than 50% of Senegalese believe that the country is less democratic now than it was 5 years ago. So, like many countries, Senegal is witnessing a democratic recession, and citizens' feelings about it is that it was less democratic now than it was 5 years ago. And then also another disturbing trend you could see is that the proportion of citizens who believe their president must obey laws, the laws and the court, increased from 69% in 2013 to 76%. However, most Senegalese also believe that their president will always ignore laws and court. Their president will always ignore the laws and court. And that is about 57% in 2022 compared to just about 13% in 2013 when the administration was fresh. So you could see that confidence in terms of citizens for democratic institutions has declined over the years in Senegal. And that is quite telling in terms of the recent event and everything that has happened. And then if you look at this other score also from the Ibrahim Index. Now, if you look at the institutional checks and balances in Senegal, it has declined over the years. So you could see that checks and balances in Senegal has declined, especially checks on the executives. Checks on the executive. So the executive, the ability of the legislature and then the judiciary to hold the executive in check, okay, has declined over the years. So if you look at, for instance, although there was broadly separation of powers in Senegal, which has largely stagnated around 60% score, you could see that in terms of legislative check compared to 2012, it has slightly declined from about 80 to just about 75 thereabouts. And that is an important thing to check in Senegal in terms of the check on the executives. And then also, if you look at the judicial check on the executive, you could see that from 2012, which was about 60% score, by 2021, it has declined to about just about 40 thereabouts. So you could see that the judicial check on the executive also has declined. Then even more worrying is the sanctions for misconduct and abuse of office. So you could see that from in terms of abuse of office, now in 2012, it was just about 82 thereabout. Then about 2015, it's improved to about 100%. And then since then, it has been on a downward trend in terms of abuse of office, mainly by the executives. So you could see that these are the worrying trend in terms of the democratic institution and the failure to be able to check the other of the organs, mainly the executive. Of course, the usual corruption in the country, you could see that corruption has also generally stagnated around since 2020. It declined to 43 in 2021 and 2022. So there has been a general stagnation, even though it improved a little bit from the 36 that it was in 2012. And then also, government effectiveness and then regulatory quality also has generally stagnated in terms of in Senegal, in terms of government effectiveness. If you look at the World Bank score on government effectiveness and then regulatory quality, you could see that from 1996 up to 2020, the score has generally stagnated, if not slightly declined. So what are some of the, in the light of all of these, institution or these findings, and then what are some of the strengths that probably I see relating to the electoral process and then the things that took place. I think the first thing that probably we like to comment on is the power of the people and the resilience with which the people, the general population, stood up for their democracy. I think that was a commendable thing in terms of supporting their institutions. So you could see a mass protest from civil society, labor unions, opposition party, academia, ordinary signalists in protecting their institution or protesting against decisions that they believe that they were not in consonance with the constitution. And that is very commendable because as you all know, we are in a West African region, a very bad neighborhood. And then whenever our political elites have their way in terms of abuse of incumbency and constitutional amendment and what have you, you will see that the end result probably might end up in a coup. But this one, the citizens stood up regardless of the consequences and the unfortunate demise of some people to protest. And then I think in the end, it's paid off. And then, of course, the Constitutional Council at the last minute, also the decision to rule against the president's actions and the laws passed by the parliament in terms of the extension of the election and the mandate of President Sall was also commendable at that time, although some people argued that that was due to the pressure from the mass pressure from the public, which is so, but I also believe that it was even commendable that they felt the atmosphere of the country and then did what was right. And then, of course, also in terms of the other ruling, to make sure that the election takes place before the president's exit of or tenure expires was also commendable. And then also maybe the Supreme Court also at the last minute throwing out a suit, dismissing a suit in terms of the Karim Wadi's suit on challenging the timelines, which cleared way for the election to hold place, was also a strength at that point. So even though there were general, checks and balances are weak, I mean, there were these institutions stood up at critical times when it was needed. And then also maybe at the last minute or so, you could see the president's decision to abide by the ruling was also commendable, irrespective of whether this whole thing was avoided, was avoidable from the beginning, but at the last minute, conceding defeat and also abiding by the ruling, the pressure from the people was also good. And then also the amnesty program, I don't know, this one is just a food for thought, the release of political detainees from the amnesty program that ensured that political detainees were released to contest the elections, and then that calmed the tension in the country, and then also probably to spare the administration of any brutalities or any charges of brutalities in the near future. Did this save the day? That is also food for thought. And then, of course, the media, despite other laws and things, the media also, there were equal access to electoral campaigns and voter and civic education. If you read, for instance, the ECOWAS reports on the election. So these are some of these are key strengths or some of the things that stood up in the process to the elections, and which I believe is commendable. So I'll briefly, I know my time is almost up, so I will briefly given all that has happened, I believe that this is a time for Senegal, for opportunity for reforms in Senegal in terms of their democratic dispensation. We have seen how the president wields so much power, and then the control of the executive over other institutions, National Assembly, and the general lack of checks and balance in Senegal is something that needs to be curtailed in terms of going forward. And the first thing probably is the role of the Ministry of Interior in terms of the electoral process. I think that given all that has taken place, it is important that the electoral processes are given to the Senate, or what we call the independent, the Autonomous National Electoral Committee, to oversee and handle more electoral staffs, so that the Ministry of Interior will not maybe under pretense ban, dissolve parties that it doesn't seem favorable with, and all of that. And then, of course, I raised this issue about two-term limits should be faced and not tampered, because although the Constitution probably is clear about that, you remember in 2012, there was President Wadi also contested a third term amid controversy and all of that. And even President Sarr himself, last year, there were issues about whether he was going to contest again, and mass protests and other things. Eventually, people believe forced him to rescind, and saying that he's not going to contest, not because he's not what do you call it? He's not qualified to contest, but because against his personal principles. So it is something that what do you call it? We should probably, I don't know how else it would be made very clear for these things not to even be contemplated about. And of course, the president's powers to postpone elections and all of those stuff, I think should be curtailed, as we have seen now in the past 2 or 3 years. Those issues should be just being opportunity for reforms, and then strengthening institutions, the judiciary, the constitutional court, and other things to be able to check the executive is important for democratic reforms or to take place in Senegal. And then, of course, the usual fight against corruption, So these are the few introductory talks that I would like to have, just to mention that based on our study that we did here at African Futures and Innovation, if Senegal is able to improve governance, it can raise its GDP per capita by additional $558 or 8.4% above what we call the business as usual scenario. So if you look at current trajectory, and then we model improved governance in terms of the democracy, improved capacity and other things, Senegal can increase its GDP per capita by that amount. And of course, 1.1 million Senegalese can also be lifted out of extreme poverty simply by improving governance based on our studies. And you can read more of that on that in the link that I provide. And then the last thing probably is that if you check the Afrobarometer result also, only 24% of Senegalese believe that the country will be much more democratic in the next 5 years. Of course, this was 2022, so probably the findings will be different now. But with this pessimism in the system, it means that the new administration has a lot to do to garner confidence in the democratic institution and then governance as a whole. So on a whole, I think that there is this event that have taken place prior to the elections is an opportunity for reforms in Senegal. As with many other countries, we know that Senegal is in a bad neighborhood, and it is probably best that this thing has taken place to test its democracy. But in the end, it has prevailed, and then the new president must seize the opportunity or the moment to be able to embark on far-reaching reforms that will enhance its democratic institutions, especially in terms of checks and balance, institutional checks and balance in the country. So I will just stop here for now, and then if there are any questions, I'll take it later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Enoch. We'll move on to our last speaker, who's Tenny. Tenny will give an overview of, the implications of, the election in Senegal in terms of what it means for the broader region and also the African continent. So over to you, Tenny.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to have listened to the last two presentations. I'd like to first of all talk about some of the parallels between the Senegalese elections and some of the elections, or some of the things that have happened in the region so far. Like you mentioned when you introduced me, I also head the Economic Intelligence Unit at Nigeria's Early Warning Center, which is under the ECOWAS Early Warning Directorate, which means that we work a lot with the different West African Early Warning Directorates, really following trends such as democratic politics or even social cohesion or social movements. So again, I'm speaking here as an analyst and without any political leanings or preferences, just to clarify that. Now, what are some of the parallels that I have observed so far with these elections and others? The one that comes to mind immediately for me is the elections in Cote d'Ivoire that happened some years ago. I know that, I mean, first of all, people would expect me to talk about the coups that have happened recently, which I will get to. But then the elections in Cote d'Ivoire, I felt held some similarities because if you remember, there was a revised constitution, there was the third term, and yeah, there were some similarities there. But in that case, so between Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, things responded differently. So two things responded differently. First of all, the people responded differently. There may not have been as much pushback in the Ivorian case for many different reasons. And also, when you go to the institutions, they may not have responded in the ways that the Senegalese institutions managed to do so. But then more on that later. The second parallel I'd like to draw is with Nigeria. I mean, I'll be remiss not to mention Nigeria, my country, where elections took place last year. And I think the parallels that I observed here really was the fact that these two elections took place after significant youth uprisings. So in Nigeria's case, there was a 2020 NSAS protest that prefaced and colored the 2023 elections. And then in Senegal, we had the 2021 Free Senegal protest that took place ahead of the 2024 elections. And if you recall, some of the mobilization that happened, for these protests in Nigeria and in Senegal did play a part in the mobilization around the elections. So it really brings to question the role of social movements, also the role of young people, and then the way that these movements are handled and how they eventually affect the democratic process. So again, as we know, the protests in Nigeria were handled a bit differently from the way that those in Senegal were handled in terms of the level of violence that was deployed as reported. Thirdly, I have to mention the recent coups that have taken place in West Africa of high interest. And it really raises the question of what channels are available to people when they are dissatisfied with their governance situation. So we have Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, Guinea, that experience what we describe as unconstitutional changes in government. And one interesting thing with these countries is that, to an extent, anecdotally, we saw a level of public support for these military leaders. So it's really people thinking, how can I change my government if I feel like elections don't work? And I'd like to mention something because, with the more recent coup that happened in Niger, the Nigerian president, who is the current chairman of ECOWAS, I believe, was sort of the face of the resistance towards that coup and the push for the restoration of democracy. But then I remember reading something or even watching a video where a Nigerian citizen said, if democracy is what you have in Nigeria, then we don't want it. So it's really the question of what kind of democratic role models or models do we have within West Africa, and what is reinforcing what? Because in some ways, the controversial elections in Nigeria, there are many different opinions around them, might have reinforced some of the sentiments around the coups that happened in West Africa around that. So this is now hoping that the Senegalese way, where it's been shown that, yes, you can use elections to change your government as far as possible. It will, give some hope to West Africans, perhaps, that you do not have to rely on military leaders who you really cannot control and who you really need to depend on for their benevolence in order for them to deliver what you expect. So these are some of the parallels, and I guess it's about, again, what are the implications? Two things on the implications. I'd say, first of all, this topic of the reversal of democracies in West Africa. What Senegal has done for us in West Africa at the moment is to show that we are really a work in progress, right? So democracies globally have been challenged, whether it's in the US or in Europe. Many citizens across the world feel like their leaders are not a reflection of their needs, and you can argue about these needs. There's a right, there's a left. But for better or for worse, many citizens feel like their leaders are not a reflection of their needs. So everyone is really trying to reconfigure and just really renavigate, what it means to have a government of the people. And I think that as we really, again, understand the West African manifestation of this, we should give ourselves some grace and really support the maturity of our own processes. The second thing on the implications, I think, is youth power. So we talk about young people a lot, but I remember reading just yesterday that now in the workplace, you have, is it 4 or 5 generations? Because We talk about the Gen Zs as the youngest generation, but now you have the Gen Alphas that are apparently already getting into the workplace. So they're almost becoming teenagers, if I'm correct. So the people that we referred to as young people 10 years ago are now mature voters. It's very important that we ensure that they stay engaged in the democratic process by allowing our institutions to work as expected. We have seen how this has manifested in Senegalese elections, and it's something that we can, the rest of us really can learn from. Let systems work so that our young people, our people in general, can trust them. And now, speaking of the lessons, I think there are a couple of other things, which should be the last section of my own comments. So another interesting thing I observed, and I think is a lesson to learn, is this need to move beyond ethnic-based politics. This was a very interesting interaction that I observed on social media, where a Nigerian commented on the ethnicity of the new Senegalese president and was trying to make an ethnic argument around it. And there was a very strong pushback and resistance from Senegalese people that said, no, we do not do that here. Do not impose your ethnic-based politics that you practice in Nigeria on us in Senegal. For us, it's about leaders that are competent and that have merit. And I found the debates there very interesting because the last Nigerian elections included sort of like an amplified weaponization of ethnic diversity. So, and I say this as someone being from the ethnic group that was the problematic ethnic group. So my group, the Yorubas, did a couple of things in some states, like in Lagos, where they really demonized other ethnic groups and fed a monster that's now we're going to struggle to tame. So again, it's to learn that we need to move beyond this ethnic-based politics, really. Do not amplify ethnicity because you're trying to win elections, because you start something that is going to be very difficult to move beyond. Senegalese have done that, so the rest of us can learn from it. Another thing I'd like to mention is selection versus rejection votes. Now, this is a bit of a tricky one. What do I mean by selection versus rejection votes? So increasingly in Africa, but also in the world, the democracies are beginning to look like rejection votes. So rather than a selection of a preferred candidate, it's a rejection of maybe an incumbent or a particular, ruling party candidate. And we need to figure out what that looks like and what that would mean going forward, because it has a lot to do with party politics and the kinds of people that we are allowed to even vote for in the first place, because you can only vote for people that the parties have put forward. So yeah, we really need to balance this thing between selection votes and rejection votes, because sometimes it means that you have a bit of a populist approach to elections where everyone moves in one direction without fully understanding what that means. I already mentioned that we need to pay attention to party politics. Super important. I don't think I need to belabor the points there. And again, it's about getting involved even from that level. The third thing I'd like to mention, or the fourth, is to penalize inconsistent ideologies. And really this politics of convenience. So one thing I observed about the opposition in Senegal, which I mean, for better or for worse, was that it was very consistent, over the last couple of years about the messaging and just about what they were trying to achieve. So it was easy for citizens to really follow that up and to follow that through. And even when at the last moment there was a change in the front runner, there was no hesitation from citizens to still follow the party. So there was a bit of consistency there, which a lot of other countries do not have in terms of their political parties and the personalities or the characters of those parties. Again, I think Enoch has spoken a lot, and even Aisatu, about independent institutions, whether we're talking about the parliament or the judiciary. I think that proven corruption in these spaces should not be taken lightly, but also there is the issue that in many of our countries, we pay too much attention to the presidency when we are voting, and not as much to these other positions, the parliaments, as one example. In Nigeria, we have the Senate or the House of Reps. We have different forms in Ghana, in Togo, in the other countries. But then it shows that these guys are sort of like, when you're describing a car, they're like your brake or your airbags, which even if you don't engage them all the time, you want to make sure that they are working and that they would work for you when you need them to work for you. So you may not engage the airbags in your car all the time, but you want to be sure that when you have an accident, the airbags will deploy as expected. So we need a lot more attention on these institutions. And we need to also find ways to penalize leaders that leaders that in turn penalize the independence of these institutions. I'll give an example. We practice a federal government here, so a federation where we have state governments. And often when you have state parliaments that try to be more independent of the executives, they are removed by the governor, which happens all the time. Even at the presidency tries to control who the leadership of the parliament is. But we should penalize those kinds of behaviors when they are displayed by politicians, because we should recognize that there is a reason for this independence. And we want to make sure that when it comes down to it, there are systems to try to hold accountable for our democratic leadership. And yeah, I think those are some of the main points. The last thing here was just about presidential powers and how different they look in our different countries. Maybe looking at that very more closely, really. How much power do you want to give the president in terms of who they can appoint and what those positions mean as far as leadership or governance go? Then to close, regional governance, which is going back to ECOWAS. You know, to what extent did ECOWAS play a role in the Senegalese elections, in the events that happened before the Senegalese elections? Was there a missed opportunity there to really reinstate or reinforce an ECOWAS for the people and ECOWAS in support of, say, democratic governance? Do we only show up, or does ECOWAS only show up when there is a problem, or do they also show up when, you know, they're supposed to just be supporting a particular process that seems positive? And yeah, I congratulate the Senegalese, hoping that this new government, you know, brings the results that they expect. But then again, it's a reminder to leaders and to people across West Africa that, you know, systems can work, and you can be removed if you do not exhibit behaviors that are expected. And that's, yeah, it's really a trial and error process, and our democracies are maturing in as flawed of a way as possible, but still trying to make some progress. Thank you so much. I hope you heard most of my comments. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much to our very brilliant and passionate speakers. We really appreciate you taking time to join us for this webinar event. But also thank you to the broader audience that attended the webinar. So at this point, it's a thank you from me. I'll hand over to Maria Luisa Fandapi, who's the head of the program, to share on perspective and also to let you know what other programs will be or events will be running in the near future. Thank you. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Darlington, and I would like to thank you for really joining today, Ten, Asantu, and Enoch. I think that there has been really a very rich discussion. The takeaway are many. I mean, personally, I was struck by this element of the democracy that is shaping and the sort of opportunity also for institutional reform, but also I think that it's very important what all of you have highlighted on the fact that there is a lot of unknown about the future, and it's very difficult actually to predict what is going to happen. But also that the way in which the practice of democracy in Senegal will shape, it will be under scrutiny in the neighborhood. And so this will be also shaping somehow the trajectory also of how the trust in democracy for the West African region as well. I think from my European perspective, I can say that maybe it's really about time to really appreciate also the importance of how the people have pushed back in this sense, and which has been highlighted by both of you in this specific circumstances, and the fact that there has been actually not a military coup, but at least for the time being, I mean, the institutional process is still standing, and I think European countries should really look at this specific experience to understand a little bit better also how to the diversity also of political experience in the entire West Africa. And I will leave it at this, but I would like really to thank you for the rich contribution. Atiai, thanks to Darlington, we will work even more on the continent, and so please stay tuned for the upcoming events. And I also would like to thank the respective institution for whom you work, and I hope that we will also be able to establish cooperation together in the future. Thank you again.